Luckily, he hasn't talked much. Although I did leave shortly after my 5th birthday, there are actually a bunch of Portmans here in town still. Some of you know them, Dick Portman and others. And that's because back in the late 1870s, the Portman family came to Northeast Ohio. They came from Switzerland. There were 9 kids in the family. They kind of pushed them out of a little town in Switzerland that I've gone back to visit since because they were very poor and it was a recession in Northern Europe at the time. They cut down a bunch of trees around the town to pay for their passage. And today you can go there and see where the trees are a little lower, and it's called the America Stand. Kind of a neat story. And my great-grandfather arrived here at 10 years old, virtually penniless. They stayed with family for a while. And this same guy, William Portman, and my son is named William after him, ended up going to Case and was one of the early medical graduates of then, I think it was called the Case Institute. His son, my grandfather, and his 2 other sons, my 2 uncles, great-uncles, were all 3 captains of the football team at Western Reserve. So I got it covered. Western Reserve and Case coming together. And it's been neat to deepen ties in Cleveland over the last couple of years or so when I've been associated with Squire Sanders. In fact, Tom Stanton, chairman of the firm, is here with us today, and other colleagues from Squire Sanders. Thank you for being here. I have also been in Northeast Ohio a lot more in the last 11 months because of this campaign. I'm going all over the state, but I'm focusing a lot in the northern part of the state, where I'm less well known and where I have a lot more to learn. I spent time at 70 different events. I counted them up on the drive up this morning. And that includes marching in the Parma Parade and the Cam's Corner Parade, going to a bunch of festivals, including some great nationality festivals where I've had some terrific food. But it's also been a lot of focus on jobs and the economy. Meeting with small businesses, as I said, meeting with workers, meeting with employed workers and unemployed workers, going to some of the important Northeast Ohio economic development groups, healthcare facilities, business incubators, talking about jobs. And I plan to continue doing that. I've learned a lot, but I have more to learn, and it's great to hear directly from people, to hear from Clevelanders what's on their mind, and to talk about how we can work together for a brighter future for the Cleveland area and for our state. If I'm privileged to be able to represent our state in the United States Senate, Northeast Ohio will have an advocate, and an advocate who has taken the time to understand the region's priorities. It won't be new to me because although I represented Southern Ohio in Congress, I also worked a lot with the Cleveland delegation on issues of concern to Northeast Ohio. I didn't have much choice because my friend Steve LaTourette is never shy about promoting Cleveland interests. He does a terrific job. He's a great advocate for the area. And so I was involved in federal funding issues for medical research, infrastructure, and other issues for Steve. Another friend of mine and a mentor is George Voinovich. We've worked very closely over the years. We developed a relationship when he was governor, and I had proposed in Congress an Unfunded Mandates Relief Act to get rid of the practice of federal government sending unfunded mandates down to the state and local government without paying for them. And at that time, George Voinovich was head of the Governors Association and was an incredibly effective advocate in Washington for the proposal, which ended up getting enacted into law under President Bill Clinton. And from that time, we've also worked closely on many other legislative issues. I'm proud to have his endorsement. I'm even more grateful to have his counsel and advice from a guy who's a true public servant. I'm also proud of the relationship that I had and the partnership I had with former Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones. Some of you knew Stephanie. As I'd done with her predecessor, Lou Stokes, who is now a colleague of mine at Squire Sanders. We partnered on legislation in sort of an interesting area. It was really to promote the lessons of the Underground Railroad. Cooperation, the quest for freedom. Cincinnati, as you may know, has the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. And Lou and then Stephanie, after Lou, were the co-sponsors of legislation that we had, both for that institution, but also for networking Underground Railroad sites around the country. Stephanie was also one of the 4 original co-sponsors with me on legislation I authored called the Second Chance Act, which focuses on prisoner reentry, providing treatment and job skills to decrease recidivism, the wasteful revolving door we now have in our criminal justice system. And her passion and leadership on that issue derived from what she saw here in the Cleveland community and was absolutely critical to passage of the legislation, which has now been signed into law and is helping to reduce the number of repeat offenders in Ohio and around the country. I've also worked alongside the Cleveland delegation when I was in Congress and as budget director on the federal facilities that are here. And Cleveland has some great ones. One, of course, is NASA Glenn. And I've worked with Steve LaTourette, Dennis Kucinich, Senators Brown and Voinovich, Cleveland Partnership, who's represented here today, and others on being sure that we secure NASA Glenn's position as a national asset and a regional foothold in our nation's space program, and a critical part of Ohio's heritage and future in aerospace research and aerospace production. NASA Glenn offers tremendous opportunities for Cleveland and Northeast Ohio, but the same goes for another federal entity called DFAS, the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. Some of you have followed the DFAS up and downs over the years. At one time it was in danger of significant downsizing, maybe even being eliminated, and now it's taking on new tasks, including most recently issuing identification cards for the U.S. Coast Guard, which is a big responsibility. And I look forward to continuing to help sustain and grow these federal facilities that create government jobs, but also create private sector spinoff opportunities here in Northeast Ohio. As I said, my last visit to the City Club was about 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago, in fact. And at that time, Dick, I did talk about a balanced budget, because I had just finished proposing to the Congress a balanced budget to put the government in the black for the first time in nearly a decade. That seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? Thinking about a balanced budget. At that time, the deficit was on the decline. It was, as a percent of the economy, 1.2%. And that's an important way to look at it. Most economists think that's the proper measure, which was, by the way, about half of the historical average of 2.4%. So our deficit was on the decline and a relatively small part of our economy. In fact, when I was at OMB as Director of the Office of Management and Budget, the deficit was cut in half to $161 billion. Now, I thought that was too high. Compare that to today's deficit of $1.4 trillion, 9 times higher in just a few years, which is, of course, the largest deficit ever at $1.4 trillion. And as a percent of the economy, remember I talked about how important that measurement is, it's now 10% of the economy, as opposed to 1.2%, as opposed to that historical average we talked about, being the highest deficit as a percent of the economy since World War II. And in World War II, things were different because our growth in spending was primarily defense spending, which was immediately able to be curtailed. That's not the case today. At the same time, 3 years ago, I looked at the unemployment numbers. We had low unemployment in this country and in this state. In fact, the unemployment number was less than half of what it is today. A lot can change in 3 years. Part of it was the financial crisis and the housing bubble. And part of it's how Congress chose to respond with massive increases in spending and an increase in the role of government. Now our country not only has the largest deficit in history, but also a national debt of $12 trillion that's expected under current plans to double in the next 4 years and probably triple in the next 12 years. Even worse, our unemployment rate in Ohio is now over 10%, 10.5%, the highest it's been in decades. And if you take into account those still looking for work and therefore who've stopped looking for work, who are not on the unemployment rolls anymore, our unemployment rate in Ohio is closer to 16%, according to economists. What does 16% translate into? That's about 947,000 Ohioans. So think about that. More than double the population of the city of Cleveland are out there looking for work or have given up work looking because they can't find anything. People who are struggling to make ends meet, they can't find work. They're worried about their health care. They're worried how they're going to pay the mortgage. They're worried about how they're going to send their kids to school. And unfortunately, by the White House's own admission, the high rate of joblessness is likely to continue at least until 2011. And Governor Strickland's economic advisors are suggesting the same thing. As I travel around Ohio, and I've been to about 3/4 of Ohio's counties, over 68 counties out of 88, and I'm going to get to all of them. But as I've done that in the past 11 months in this campaign, I do spend a lot of time talking with people who are making the decisions about jobs, small business owners. I've also met with workers, as I've said, those who are gainfully employed, those who are underemployed, and those who are looking for work. I've met with families struggling to make ends meet, and I do that to hear about their challenges, but also to listen to their ideas, their suggestions.